I wanted to share a piece I wrote back in 2010 on globalization, and it's titled Nike and the Like, the American Birth of Globalization. And while I focus primarily on Nike, they are not by any means alone in this process. Take any major brand sold at Gap, Walmart, etc., and by and large made in factories overseas for cheap labor, and I go into some of the reasons behind it. My father saw the writing on the wall when he was in the workforce in the 1980s. This was the beginning of the switch from traditional American manufacturers to globalization being cheered on by the major corporations. The elite in power asked the daring question: why are we continuing to pay quality wages for Americans when we can make goods cheaper from foreign labor overseas? Many in power at that time, of course, knew the dreaded outcome of this would be sure to bring much disorder towards the honest working class families. The problem was that working class families wouldn't benefit them with profit like the multinational corporate state. President Reagan symbolized the turn over from honest, hard-working America to a nation that sought to obtain the most wealth by whatever means necessary. He was known for taking away rights from unions and invited special interest groups to have a seat in power. Ever since then, one by one, American factories shut down along with American hope. Goods went from being made in Pennsylvania or Detroit to China and Thailand. The wages paid, the quality of the products, and the quality of America were all lowered to put more money and power in the corporate pocket. This grave mistake has proven to cause harm in just about any way it's looked at. These poor nations, especially in China particularly, have absolutely no consideration for human rights. No one will successfully achieve a rebellion in China without severe imprisonment or death by the government of their own country. You've probably heard recently about the democracy rebellion, the democracy hero in Myanmar being released from prison. This was largely due to coverage from the American media rather than the nation's own decisions. Environmentally, flying and shipping goods all over the world leaves a tremendous carbon footprint that was unheard of years ago. Those who deem global warming is a myth have not paid enough attention. The Arctic ice caps have been melting at an ever-increasing rate, and deserts across the world are expanding as lakes and rivers are shivering up to the bone. Anyone carefully looking at the consequences of globalization would consider it detrimental in these areas. One of the most powerful corporations playing a major role in this process is Nike. From shoes to basketballs to headphones, Nike sells millions of products in the United States that are imported from China and many other third world nations around the globe. With soaring profits and relentless, intimidating power, Nike, along with others, put personal gain above everything else. The following list represents some issues posed to the Nike Corporation back in 1998 due to consumer interest. First demand: protect workers who speak honestly about factory conditions. Nike's track record in protecting workers who blow the whistle on sweatshop conditions is very poor. The company has turned its back on individual workers who have been victimized for speaking to journalists and has cut and run from other factories after labor abuses have been publicized. Until this changes, Nike workers have good reason to keep silent about factory conditions for fear that speaking honestly may result in them and their fellow workers losing their jobs. Second demand: regular, transparent, independent, and confidential procedures for monitoring factories and investigating worker complaints. Activists have repeatedly asked Nike to allow groups to educate workers about their rights and ensure workers can make confidential complaints and independent monitors when those rights are infringed. Instead, Nike has made it the responsibility of each factory to educate workers on Nike's code of conduct and to establish a complaint mechanism. This deliberately ignores the interest factory owners have in keeping workers ignorant of their rights. All independent research indicates that the overwhelming majority of Nike workers do not understand their rights under Nike's code and do not believe factory owners can be trusted to resolve worker grievances. Rights groups have also called for a factory monitoring program, which is independent and rigorous. In response, Nike has set up an elaborate array of different schemes for monitoring and factory assessment. While this variety of programs looks impressive in a public relations sense, Nike has deliberately set up each of these programs so that they fail two or more of the key tests of effective monitoring: independence, transparency, and regularity, and a relationship of trust with workers. The quarterly program of SAFE, Safety, Health, Attitude, People, Environment, assessments conducted by Nike staff is obviously the least independent. There is no evidence that Nike staff actually interviews workers as part of these assessments, let alone attempts to establish a relationship with them. Nike's program of annual factory monitoring by the PricewaterhouseCoopers also lacks independence. PwC was selected by Nike, reports to Nike, and conducts a program designed by Nike. To the extent that independent observation of PwC's monitoring practice has been allowed, it indicates that PwC auditors fail to establish a relationship of trust with workers and factory owners, and that the quality of their monitoring can be extremely poor. Dara O'Rourke, an assistant professor at MIT, recently observed several PwC factory audits firsthand and concluded that they had significant and seemingly systematic biases in favor of factory owners and against the interests of workers. While there are elements of the Fair Labor Association, FLA's, proposed monitoring program that represent important improvements on Nike's current very poor system, the association's ability to ensure that workers' rights are respected will be significantly undermined both by the questionable independence of its external monitors and by the long delays between factory monitoring visits, which will on average occur in each factory only once every 10 years. The Global Alliance for Workers and Communities is an attempt by Nike to shift focus away from human rights agenda promoted by the company's critics. The Alliance deliberately avoids investigating key human rights issues, and its research methodology does not allow time for researchers to create a relationship of trust with workers. Nike has vigorously opposed the Workers' Rights Consortium, a factory monitoring system that is independent, transparent, and makes it a priority to build trusting relationships with workers. In contrast, Nike's monitoring and factory assessment programs are not independent, they lack full transparency, and have so far made very little effort to win workers' trust so they can speak honestly about factory labor conditions without fear of reprisal. Third demand, decent wages. Nike has rejected demands that it ensures Nike workers are paid a living wage, that is, a full-time wage that would provide a small family with an adequate diet, housing, and other basic necessities. Instead, the company has used statistics selectively and in a misleading fashion to give the false impression that wages currently paid to Nike workers are fair and adequate. Meanwhile, those workers struggle to survive on wages that barely cover their individual needs, let alone those of their children. Fourth demand, reasonable working hours. Independent research indicates that in many factories, Nike workers are still being coerced into working up to 70 hours per week and are being humiliated in front of other workers or threatened with dismissal if they refuse. Nike workers also frequently report that it is extremely difficult to obtain sick leave, and that the annual leave to which they are legally entitled is often refused, reduced, or replaced with cash without the worker having any choice in the matter. Fifth demand, safe and healthy workplaces. Nike has made important progress in reducing the use of toxic chemicals in sport shoe production. Unfortunately, on the few occasions in recent years that genuinely independent health and safety experts have been allowed to access to Nike's contract factories, they have found serious hazards, including still dangerously high levels of toxic chemicals, inadequate personal protective equipment, and lack of appropriate guards to protect workers from dangerous machinery. There is also considerable evidence of workers suffering stress from spending large amounts of time in high-pressure and frequently abusive work environments. Sixth demand, respect for workers' right to freedom association. So far, Nike's promise to protect this right has been largely empty. A considerable proportion of Nike's goods are made in countries like China, where independent unions are illegal. Nike has refused to call on the Chinese government to allow workers to organize and has actively opposed calls for trade pressure to be put on the Chinese government to encourage it to improve its record in this regard. Nike has abjectly failed to prevent the suppression of unions in a number of its contract factories, including the PT Nikomas Gemeling and the PT ADF factories in Indonesia, the Siwan and Y Lead textile factories in China, the Formosa factory in El Salvador, the Natural Garment factory in Cambodia, the Savina factory in Bulgaria, and factories owned by the Saha Union Group and the Bangkok Rubber Group, as well as the Nice Apparel, Deluxe, Line Tie, and Par Garment factories in Thailand. On those few occasions when Nike has taken any steps to advance this right in specific territories, it has done so grudgingly and after considerable public pressure. While elements of Nike's eventual response to the current dispute in the Cukdong factory in Mexico has been positive, Nike's actions on this issue have been characterized by unnecessary delays, lack of follow-through, and failure to actively promote the urgent need for a free and fair union election. In some cases, such as reducing toxic chemicals, Nike has made significant progress, but by and large, Nike continues to keep personal gain above individual rights. The fact that these issues are presented to Nike should be an indicator that a corporation like this has too much power and should either change its practices or be banned from doing business. Nike is not the only one like this, of course. Walk into any Walmart, Sears, and one will find ample multinational corporate products. I don't know if America's essential manufacturing goods will ever return. If they were to, it would take much effort, but I, along with many others, feel that it must be done. Ideally, we should have never gotten to the point where we decided to ship the majority of our bases overseas, manufacturing bases. Detroit was once famous for being one of the nation's leading manufacturers in automobiles. Ever since Ford Motor Company moved its manufacturing base in Detroit overseas, countless families have been left without jobs, health care, benefits packages, and hope. Just remember, the next time one of the talking heads on Fox News or MSNBC boasts the benefits of unfettered corporate capitalism and free markets, remind them to look beneath the surface. Its consequences are often disastrous and are worth a second investigation. And the good news is there are still plenty of American companies that are making quality clothing. Some brands that I personally like are Texas Jeans, Aqua, AKWA, Union Line, King Louis America, Cobblestones, WSI Sporting Gear, Physique Bodywear, some New Balance shoes, not all of them are made in the U.S., Bayside, and Race Ready Sporting Gear. And two great websites that I use to buy these clothes are MadeInUSAForever.com, founded by Todd Lipscomb, and AllUSAClothing.com. Both are good sites that have a wide display of American-made products for reasonable prices. And I hope this movement continues to grow. I hope pressure continues to mount in regards to the Trans-Pacific Partnership and it being fast-tracked. I heard this agreement would prevent us from buying American, prevent us from having a choice to support our own economy. And as someone who's been passionate about this issue for years, I strongly side whenever I get a chance to on bringing back our manufacturing one purchase at a time.